So it seems like the WWE tag titles on SmackDown are essentially hostage to this months long MFT White 6 feud that's been kind of happening over this past year, right? And I kind of want to look at the trajectory of specifically within the MFTs, or I guess this Bloodline 2.0 that was renamed to the MFTs kind of went, and how kind of disappointed it kind of has been. Just unfortunately, with everyone kind of involved except maybe really Solo, we haven't really been able to see too much character work really involved with any of the other members. I mean, I think really except for Tama Tonga being able to get a saying off and, you know, be able to see the Gorillas of Destiny's old war paint, we haven't really been able to see any real big character moments, I guess, involved for this faction that's now at this point, you know, been going on for about a year. It's interesting too because, you know, from essentially what was the biggest storyline of the 2020s that kind of kicked off this whole era, we had Solo in this prime seat, kind of ready essentially to take that next step and to move forward kind of as his own competitor, as his own person, now removed from the bloodline with his, you know, eventual kind of kick out. And I think, you know, obviously sticking him with many of the Samoans that were coming in, you know, I think is actually a really good idea. The problem though, I think, comes when you then take the nuance that you had in the bloodline kind of backstage segments and the inter kind of familial troubles and interpersonal relationships that were evolving and changing. When you take that out of the said faction, you kind of lose exactly what made it like interesting to watch in the first place and allowed people to get invested in those characters. You don't really have very much of a clue really of JC Mateo, Talatonga, Tamatongas, or Toalongas, like really any of their MOs, except that they kind of bowed to Solo. And while Solo has had a lot of time and experience now in playing that heel, he's extremely great at that, and he is kind of primed for, you know, a higher card position anytime they kind of want to do that for him. And he does great work in the stuff he's been given now, but you know, that opportunity hasn't really been reflected on the other guys in terms of, you know, promo time, character work, or significant story beats like happening. I do want to address though with, you know, that the Tama Tonga and kind of Shinsuke kind of subplot that seems to be happening right now, kind of around the MFTs, getting attacked by essentially a bunch of the SmackDown locker room, and it kind of harkens back to both their days in New Japan, back at the time when, you know, Tama Tonga and Tonga Loa were in the Bullet Club as the Gorillas of Destiny, which their face paint that now the whole MFT squad adapted was originally from, and where I kind of found them, you know, and became fans of them, big fans. And, you know, he was telling Shinsuke essentially that he wasn't up to snuff, essentially reflecting back on the AJ Styles match that happened at the past Saturday night's main event, and Shinsuke kind of took issue with that, and we've kind of had a couple matches back and forth now. Well, Tama Tonga is now a couple wins over Shinsuke, obviously due to interference, but in watching those matches, there's really no fire there at all for, and like they're happy when Shinsuke is coming out, and that's essentially how the segment kind of goes. The match kind of goes the way it does. People pop for Shinsuke's moments, and then it kind of goes flat once Tama wins, because once again, the modern, you know, main roster crowd isn't going to be privy to the New Japan background, especially if you don't really indate them with that, especially also after having these characters exist on TV for such a long time without ever mentioning these things. It makes the fans who do know these things feel stupid. AEW does a great job, for example, of kind of letting the audience know about the various promotions and things that exist outside the world of wrestling, and that there's an ecosystem. I think WWE now, especially in a Triple H era, has done a better job of doing that, right? But, you know, they still have a lot of work to do. And I think this is a case in point with the Tama Tonga and Shinsuke Nakamura kind of sub-feud that seems to be happening. While I am harping on all the negatives of that happening, at least it is a shot for the other members of the tag team championships, you know, multi-time champions at this point, who haven't really gotten real character moments. They've kind of all just been essentially bodyguards for Solo in essentially a faceless entourage of that's essentially just the ghost of a bloodline. The emotional highs and everything that happened within there, you know, I feel like Solo should be carrying those kind of moving forward into what's happening now with the MFTs into the White Six. I think that, the fact that there's no real reflection on that, there's no tension between any of the Samoans about, that past and about what the other Samoans are doing is kind of interesting. It kind of feels, it's kind of just disappointing, because I feel like something like the Bloodline and then this 2.0 with the MFT should be kind of an ongoing big story that can really culminate into something greater if there was more attention put into how the bloodline essentially fractured. Looking at how, for example, we had Hikuleo, who was making big waves in New Japan, because while New Japan doesn't have the biggest or best track record with using big men, I think they did a good job with Hikuleo using his size and everything to make him stand out. Kind of similar to an Omos presence in AAA right now, or in Noah. And I think obviously it was a better bet for him to come to WWE, the land of the giants, just because the presentation and how he would kind of work. WWE is perfect for those types of, I think, athletes and stuff. But just for him to kind of become another faceless goon, amongst this lineup, essentially. Same thing with JC Mateo, Jeff Cobb. Jeff Cobb was a high-flying powerhouse who was super interesting, kind of had a wave gimmick, kind of like how Sol Ruka kind of is on for the women. He could have been a similar kind of I think cool kind of gimmick like that in the main roster, as like a cool heavyweight, almost similar to how they probably wanted Matt Riddle to be, but more PG, less weed. They essentially kind of shoved him once again as a faceless kind of mean goon with the rest of the MFTs. And I do think that you could still have, all these guys together essentially, but just like you kind of did with the Bloodline, you have your moments in time where you're focusing on each individual relationship. You focused on when Sammy and Jay had to, kind of get used to each other. Jimmy was always kind of slimy to Sammy, even though he was always buddy with him, but that's because it was all in the pretense of like, hey, he's just another body we can use, where Jay had that legitimate distrust, which was funny, but because of that blind loyalty to his bloodline, that's why that relationship was so funny between him and Sammy, right? And became kind of what it is now, and is now a cherished kind of context to WWE canon. That's what we're kind of like lacking, I think, in terms of long-term progression for this MFT kind of group. I think the Wyatt Six too is kind of another example of that, where you have the Wyatt Six, this reimagining of Bray Wyatt's legacy that Bo Dallas is taking on, and he's done a great job of emulating it, but I do think in terms of how the character should have permeating, lasting impact on the rest of the superstars is still left to be really seen, especially with how crazy their debut was. It seemed like they were going in a new direction in how they wanted to present things, but now fast forward to where we are now in this everlasting feud between the MFTs and the Wyatt Six, and it's just smoke and mirrors, kind of blackouts all the time, in a hot potato between the tag titles. On paper, you would think that these two kind of behemoth teams, with the roster that they kind of have with each other, would have such it would just be such an engaging kind of thing. But I think WWE has kind of just dropped the ball here narratively in terms of making these teams not only feel threatening and like an actual presence on the show, but actively dangerous and urgent. The MFTs and Wyatt Six are operating in this limbo, whereas the rest of the tag teams on SmackDown are even operating on their own like leisure, floating in the US division with Elia and Mello, and having these random segments that don't seem to give any sort of urgency or agency to them as well, which kind of makes them look weak in a way, that they're not actively trying to get involved with this Wyatt Six MFT kind of business. It's weird to say, but like, as I guess it's maybe it is a main roster, or NXT 2 main roster thing. Triple H seemed to have had a really good hold or whatever on like the team that he was using during NXT. They all had a really good hold on tag teams and booking the tag team division in NXT, to a point that you could have main evented the show with a lot of the feuds that were happening for that tag team belt at the time on NXT. It's kind of interesting to see that just such lack of a focus, or lack of real narrative structure, or just plot points happening for these teams, and especially for everyone kind of involved. I feel like the the lopsided crowd reactions you always see to the certain superstars is because of not just on them, it's the lack of I've said it in a previous video, kind of with the WWE peaking video, where there's a lack of investment in these characters. And when we know that there's a lack of investment in these characters, then we start to also have disinterest, because obviously even everyone involved doesn't really care about their time. This is just about moving along to the next segment. When someone like a Kit Wilson is making, when they're making great use of the time in a comedy segment like that, when they do the timing, of turning on this music after attacking Matt and then coming in to do those things, and then the next week he feeds Oma to Obafemi, that feels natural. That is how you do those events. You build up a character in Kit Wilson so that you want to see him get punched, right, and beat up, by someone. And then who else but the current hot free agent on a wrecking spree to get a surprise pop with than Obafemi. It's perfect. And then it's kind of like a running gag that you can kind of have Obafemi and Kit Wilson kind of orbiting him, while he ascends up in the roster. I think that'd be kind of hilarious. I think that is what's kind of missing from every single aspect of the television, is that are these focal points. And the thing is I feel like while I know not every single thing is given the same amount of attention, obviously there needs to be more of a delegation in terms of how they are booking, like the tag division, for example, because it shouldn't feel like things are an afterthought, you know what I mean, or that things are saved for vignettes, you know what I mean, that can possibly even air during commercial breaks in certain countries. It's obvious that if these things are happening during these times, there's a lot of filler content being made, which should never be a thing in my opinion in any form of entertainment. I think it's kind of alarming where the MFTs and kind of the White Six are right now in this kind of monotonous kind of cycle, especially when there was initially a lot of fanfare, I think, for two of the teams to clash, but now it seems like where else can we go with these? What can we do with the individual characters on each side? We got to remember that even on the White Six side, we have a former Dexter Loomis, we have a former Nikki Cross from Sanity. Like, there's a lot of, we have Joe Gacy. Like, these are all unique characters on their own that are for some reason now being relegated to Wyatt cosplayers, essentially, and obviously honoring a gimmick of someone who did deeply touch us, but we should honor it more by pushing the story forward and creating new stars and creating new exciting moments with this moving forward, instead of really doing a cosplay routine. That's what I kind of think of both what's happening with the MFTs right now and the Wyatt Six. Is kind of underwhelming. What do you guys kind of think of what's going on with the WWE tag titles? I've talked about this before, but it seems like there still needs to be work done in the men's tag teams division. Take a note from the women. We have these super teams kind of colliding right now. There's a lot of dudes in the mid card of SmackDown that can probably form up and make some cool teams. Do something, you know what I mean? But we'll see. Let me know what you guys kind of thought about this. Kind of more of another ranty one, but I thought of doing kind of more individual and focused kind of videos, kind of getting at certain aspects that I think, kind of are worth, attacking, I think, a little bit, or praising sometimes, depending on what WWE is doing. So let me know what you guys kind of think about the tag division, where they can kind of go, how can they save the Wyatt Six gimmick? How can they make the MFTs feel menacing? Let me know what you guys think. Take care.